In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, all praise is due to Allah. We praise Him and seek His help and forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah Most High from the evils of ourselves and from our wicked deeds. Distinguished guests, we would like to welcome you to this seminar this evening as part of the series of lectures that are being organized by CILE, Center for Ethics and Islamic Legislation. Would like to talk about Maslaha benefits, the parameters of Maslaha. As opposed to that, we have Mafasid, which are corruptings. These are the terms that are used by people publicly and also in private in both kind of spheres. This has been very much nationalized when it comes to modern discourse. There are a number of problematic issues that are of concern to academics and specialists in Islamic studies and other fields of knowledge. But we would like to talk about here today Maslaha and Mafsada. This is not only relevant to experts and academics, this goes beyond that to other spheres of life in the lives of people today, whether this is relevant to social spheres, economic, political alike. And when you try to search through Google and try to understand what we mean by Maslaha, which is benefit, we talk about the benefit of the citizen, the benefit of the homeland, and the benefit of Ummah, you would find so many contexts that are very much branched out. So you would find so many decisions and resolutions that are undertaken by the state when it comes to the prices of goods and so on and so forth. And you would find that the government says that this is in the interest of the citizen. And we talk also about the interest or maslaha or benefit of the homeland, of the ummah. You would find one country being aggressive to another country or going into animosity with another country just by saying that this is going to be in the interest, in the maslaha, in the benefit of al-ummah. This term, as we have said, is very much branched out, and it has so many points of interest, social, economic, and political, and so on and so forth. And there are also some Sharia dimensions as well that should be taken into account. That is why the religious level and the revelational level should be taken into account. And the person to whom this discourse is forwarded to should accept these decisions, these resolutions, because this is only in order to ward off a certain harm or in favor of a certain benefit. And there is a close link between what is called al-maslaha, which is benefit, and also the dimension of religious load that is taken into account. And there is no doubt that there is a certain kind of consensus between the public and the private when it comes levels, when it comes to the achievement of what is called benefits and harms, the warding off of harms and the accruement of benefits, and the different incidents and events, and also the different discussions when it comes to this particular term. These discussions have led to a number of thorny issues and questions. What is al-maslaha? What is benefit in particular? How can we define this term? And what does this mean? Those who participate in this current discourse, whether these are jurists or thinkers and so on and so forth, what do they mean when they use these terms in their particular context? Are there a number of standards that they resort to? Are there a number of standards that should be taken into account when we recall these terms in our modern kind of discourse? And are these standards different from time to another or from one place to another? And how can we guarantee these benefits far from any whimsical kind of inclinations? How can we guarantee these values And how can we set the parameters of benefits, and who should have the decisive final word when it comes to these different contradictory opinions? And at the end, what is the relationship between the Islamic discourse when it comes to the discussions in general and the discussions that are relevant in the different methodologies and philosophies that are outside the context of the discussions that are taking place? We're going to try tonight to look into those questions, or at least some of the questions, through this meeting to talk about the Sharia-based perspective and also the other kind of modern Islamic studies that are taking place, because we would like to see the level of consensus and also the level of disparity and difference between these different approaches. We're going to have 3 speakers with us here tonight who are specialized in different fields of knowledge. We'd like to start today with Dr. Jeremy Jones, professor of philosophy from Georgetown University here in the state of Qatar. And after that, we're going to have Dr. Felicitas Opwis, professor of Islamic studies at Georgetown University in the United States of America. And last but not least, we're going to have Dr. Mu'taz Khatib from CILE, from the College of Islamic Studies. We wish all the speakers success, and I wish you would enjoy and wish you good listening and enjoyment of the lectures that are going to be delivered by the different speakers. And I hope that I would be able to successfully moderate this session. Would like to start with the first session. Dr. Jeremy, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much for the invitation this evening. It's always an honor to be invited to speak at CILE, the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics at Hamad bin Khalifa University. So, I'm often asked to give sort of a Western, more secular perspective on ethics, which I learn quite a lot from my colleagues here about, and I've been learning a lot over the last couple of days about Maslaha, because my knowledge of Islamic ethics and Islamic jurisprudence is pretty limited. So I'm here to offer a different perspective, the perspective of Western philosophy, and what some things in Western philosophy have to say that might be relevant to the topic of public benefit. My daughter has recently become a big fan of the Broadway musical Hamilton. This musical is about Alexander Hamilton, who's one of the founding fathers of the United States. It also tells the story of how the United States started out as a British colony, how it fought its war of independence against British rule, and so on. So I've been learning a lot about U.S. history. I'm not actually sure that musicals are the best way to learn about history, but it's more fun than reading in any case. Now, one thing that we learn is that many of the historical figures whom we honor were very far from perfect people. They had lots of flaws. They had lots of faults. For example, here is a political cartoon of Thomas Jefferson from 1804. He was one of the founding fathers of America and its third president, making political use of the fact that Jefferson had a long-running affair with one of his female slaves. So, again, many of the historical figures who are honored are very far from perfect. But many of the historical figures about whom we learn were very admirable. They were extremely honorable people. So in learning of this musical, I learned of one person of whom I had never heard before. And this person is John Lawrence. He was a very close friend of Alexander Hamilton's. He was passionately against slavery, and he wrote that the United States could not in good conscience fight for its own freedom as long as it enslaved people. He believed in the equality of the races. Long before this belief was widespread in the United States, he lobbied very hard to get the South to allow slaves to fight in the Revolution in exchange for their freedom. He fought in vain because the South was not interested at all in letting that happen. And he himself died heroically fighting the British for American independence. George Washington, who was, of course, America's first president, wrote about Lawrence, "He had not a fault I could ever discover. unless it were bravery bordering upon recklessness, and to this he was driven by the purest motives. So Lawrence is remembered as a noble, virtuous, and brave man. When you read about people like John Lawrence, it's natural to ask, how are you and I going to be remembered? Are we going to be remembered as brave and noble and virtuous? How do you want to be remembered? By your children, by your friends? What kind of people do you want your children to be? When you're gone, do you want to be remembered as a person who lied to get your way, who always knew how to take advantage of others, who always exploited weakness? Or do you want to be remembered as a person of kindness, a person of integrity, a person who could be trusted to do the right thing? Now, this is a question of personal virtue, of private virtue, it seems, but it has a deeper connection, I think, with the topic of tonight, the topic of public benefit. I was recently listening to a talk by a historian who pointed out that many of the great thinkers who wrote about public benefit first wrote about private virtue and private morality. So, for example, before Aristotle wrote his Politics, he wrote the Nicomachean Ethics. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle discusses at length how an individual can lead a life which is virtuous, a flourishing life, a good life, a life which is a good life for a human being to have lived. For Aristotle, it's important to talk about virtue before you talk about politics, because for Aristotle, there's a very close relation between ethics, virtue, and politics. There are several close relations, actually. First, only virtuous people are suited for politics. This is an obvious enough connection. I'm not going to spend much time on this because I think this is very obvious to everyone. In every single country, my own included, people complain all the time about politicians and civil servants, that they're corrupt, that they're self-serving, that they put their own interests ahead of the interests of their nation and their people. Wouldn't it be nice, we always say, if only virtuous, ethical people went into public service, people who will do the right thing and act for the public interest? And yes, I think we can all agree that that would be very nice. But as I said, that's a very obvious point. It's not worth dwelling on. But for Aristotle, there's actually a second connection between, this is going to be the death of me. There's actually a second connection between ethics and politics. And the second connection is that the state cannot prosper without virtuous citizens. There's a third connection, which I'm going to come to later, I promise. But let's look for a moment at the second connection. Again, the topic of our discussion today is public benefit. But philosophers like Aristotle recognize that it is impossible to talk about public benefit without talking about private virtue. Virtue in society produces order, it produces predictability, it produces benefit for the public. Think about how many times every single day you expect other people to behave according to the rules of virtue. The College of Islamic Studies, for example, told you that they were having a lecture tonight, and you just assumed that they were telling the truth. You would
do it this way.
Oh, is it this way?
Yes,
Okay.
yes,
Maybe that's my problem. You would have been very surprised tonight if you'd shown up and found an empty auditorium, which I guess you would if you've gone to that auditorium. I put the wrong one on there. Oh, okay. Sorry, my bad. So, yeah, if it had turned out that they hadn't been telling you the truth, you would have been very surprised. But of course, it probably never even crossed your minds that they were tricking you, right? You just assume that they're going to behave with virtue, with honesty. You assume that when a friend visits your house, they're not going to put your expensive silverware in their pocket when you're not looking, right? You assume this. You assume that if you find yourself in distress in a public place or ill, you can safely predict that people are going to offer you help and assistance, no matter where you are. So, again, think of how many times per day you just assume that other people are going to act with at least some minimal level of virtue. Now, lack of private virtue is harmful to the public welfare. Now, there are obvious ways. Criminal activity, murder, theft, impose costs on society, both directly and in terms of putting criminals on trial, putting them in jail, and so on. Corruption, the paying of bribes, is widely believed by economists to reduce economic growth. It makes the economy less efficient and so is harmful to nations as a whole. When private citizens are not virtuous, everyone pays the price. Simply put, there can be no public benefit without private virtue. Let me give you another example. As Dr. Ghaly pointed out, I teach at Georgetown University. Every year when students are admitted to Georgetown University, the dean for the Honor Council always asks the students a series of questions. He always asks them about the importance of doing honest work. And he puts it to them like this. When you are driving across a bridge, do you want that bridge to be designed by someone who cheated their way through engineering school, or by someone who earned their degree honestly? If you go to the hospital, do you want to be treated by someone who cheated their way through medical school, or who worked hard and earned their degree honestly? Do you want your children taught by dishonest cheaters or by honest hard workers? What kind of society do you want to live in? Now, in the first place, this is a question of what kind of people make up this society. People who exercise virtue or people who do not. But the connection between private virtue and public benefit should be very clear and very obvious. Now, of course, private virtue is not enough to produce public benefit. It is pointed out often enough that there are many injustices in society that may exist just because of the way that society is put together, not because anyone is behaving immorally. These are so-called structural or institutional injustices. For example, in my country, the United States, schools are often funded by property taxes. Therefore, in wealthier areas, where there are more expensive houses, more property taxes are collected, which leads to wealthier schools being built. In poorer areas, which have poorer houses, fewer property taxes are collected, and therefore you have, as a result, someone who can't operate PowerPoint. You have, as a result, poorer schools, right? And this is just a direct result of how the system is put together. It's not necessarily any person behaving immorally. It's just the way the institutions are operated and put together. Now, what this means, however, is that wealthy students go to well-funded schools, poor students go to badly funded schools, and so advantage is preserved from one generation to the next. So this is an institutional injustice, but I strongly suspect that without people of private virtue, institutional injustices like these will never be fought or corrected. Okay, so as I said earlier, there is for Aristotle a third connection between ethics and politics. So the third connection is that the goal of politics, this is the goal of politics, is to produce virtuous, happy, flourishing citizens. So one of the public benefits, if you want to talk about public benefit, one of the public benefits to be promoted by the state and by society at large is private virtue. And of course, private virtue, as I've been arguing, in turn promotes public benefit. So for Aristotle, private virtue, public benefit, and politics are all intertwined and cannot be separated. Now, I don't know if this idea, the idea that the goal of politics should be to promote private virtue, is a very popular idea these days, at least in the West, but it is a view, at the very least, with ancient roots in Western philosophy. So here's the question, at least it's the question that I'm going to ask. Why is this view not popular, at least in the West? The view that it's the job of society to promote virtue in its citizens. Why is that not a popular view? Now, I think part of the worry is that people fear that society will become oppressive of people's freedoms. It will impose a particular way of life on them. It will enforce a particular moral code or a particular religion in a way that's harmful to minorities in society and that robs people of their important freedoms. I think that's the worry when you say it's society's job to impose virtue. And I think maybe this is why more and more in the West, people have come to understand morality as dealing only with that behavior that involves other individuals. In other words, more and more in the West, the attitude is that, here we go, the attitude is that if behavior only involves you yourself or others with their consent, then it's not a moral question at all. This is why increasingly, for example, private sexual behavior is not considered a moral matter at all in many Western countries. And so private behavior that only affects you, is often considered not even to be a moral question at all. However, if your behavior can affect someone else, if it affects someone else's well-being or their welfare, then it becomes a moral matter, and hence a question for society's judgment and maybe society's intervention. So, for example, if you are dishonest in your dealings with others, or if you put others at risk by your behavior, say by driving drunk, or if you engage in other behaviors that negatively affect other people, now it's a moral question. But in a way, and this is important, limiting the authority of society over the individual in this way also reflects a moral judgment. It reflects a judgment that individual liberty is important and should be protected as much as here we go. It reflects the judgment that individual liberty is important and should be protected as much as possible from society's interference. It reflects a judgment that individual rights should stand as a wall protecting individuals from being sacrificed needlessly to the community's preference and desires. Not every society has these values, but make no mistake, this way of elevating the individual in society itself reflects a particular moral point of view. And this brings us to the final connection between politics and ethics. When we talk about public benefit, we have to recognize that there's no way to talk about what is a public benefit without first talking about our ethical values. For example, in my country, the United States, it has been decided that it advances legitimate public policy goals, the welfare of children, respecting rights, equal consideration, and other measures of public benefit. It's been decided that it advances these public policy goals to allow, for example, same-sex couples to adopt children. But such a decision is not made without a judgment of the value of such relationships. Or take an example that I borrow from the philosopher Michael Sandel. The United States, along with many, many other countries, has what are called religious accommodation laws. And what this means is that an employer has to allow you to do things that your religion requires, even if these things conflict with certain rules that the employer has. For example, the employer dress code. So for example, if your employer forbids head covering, but your religion requires it, the employer has to accommodate that if they reasonably can. So to give an example, if you wear a beard for religious reasons, if you wear a beard because your religion requires it, your employer cannot require you to shave it off. But if you wear a beard, for example, because you're a huge fan of the band ZZ Top, your employer can require you to shave it off and can fire you if you refuse. What's the difference? The difference is obvious. The difference reflects our judgment that religion is important. And it reflects the idea that our public policy must accommodate this important element of human life. So our public policy reflects our ethical values, our values of what's important. And so to conclude, I was asked tonight to talk, I think from a Western philosophical perspective, about the idea of public benefit. There's a long tradition in the West of distinguishing between politics on the one hand and private morality on the other hand. But as I hope I've made clear, this distinction is not so easily made. There is no way to legislate for the public interest without a clear conception of what has ethical value. So truly, public benefit, personal virtue, and judgments of what have real value simply cannot be separated. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Professor Mohammed Ghaly and the CILE Center in order to be here, and also yesterday where we already had a very interesting discussion on the topic of Maslaha. And I'm also very pleased to see so many people here for the public lecture that is exploring various angles of the conception of Maslaha and the Maqasid al-Sharia, as well as their implementation. And what I'm going to do today here is give a brief historical overview of the concept of Maslaha and the closely related complex of the purposes or objectives of the law, the Maqasid al-Sharia. Maslaha and the purposes of the law came over the course of centuries, and in particular today, to be an important vehicle of resolving legal situations that are not addressed in the textual sources of the law, the Quran and Hadith. They allow Islamic law to accommodate and adapt to the ever-changing environment. I will first briefly talk about the approaches taken to Maslaha and the Maqasid al-Sharia by pre-modern Muslim jurists, and then talk about the ways in which Muslim scholars of the 20th and 21st century understand these concepts. Rulings and laws that consider the common good and welfare of people have been established since Islam's early days. Examples are the Caliph Umar's ruling to suspend the had punishment for theft during times of famine, as well as his decision to keep the irrigated Sawad lands of Iraq under state control for the good of all of the community instead of distributing it as booty. Yet as a recognizable, more or less defined legal procedure or as a technical term, maslaha and its procedural equivalent istislah first appear in writings on legal theory in the 10th century Common Era. Until then, references to maslaha do not seem to have a specific form of legal argument or law-finding procedure in mind. The breakthrough in defining maslaha as a legal concept came with Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111. He was the most important scholar to define and integrate maslaha into the law-finding procedures. He defined maslaha in the following manner. Maslaha is the purpose, the maqsad of the divine law, namely to protect for humankind their religion, deen, life, nafs, intellect, aql, offspring, nasl, and property, mal. Whatever attains and preserves these elements on the level of necessity, darura, need, haja, and improvement, tahsin, constitutes maslaha and is intended by the lawgiver, and whatever harms them is a mafsada, a cause of corruption that needs to be averted. Al-Ghazali employed maslaha as a means to resolve legal cases that were not expressly decided in the scriptural sources of the law and that could not be resolved through the deductive reasoning of analogy, of qiyas. a ruling derived by considering the resulting maslaha is valid and part of Islamic law because it accords with the objectives of the divine law. Such a ruling is not based on a particular legal proof text or a scriptural ruling. That means it's unattested, mursal. But, as Al-Ghazali emphasized, such unattested maslaha rulings are based on innumerable pieces of evidence that, as a whole, support the jurist's finding. Procedurally, Al-Ghazali integrated maslaha into analogy, where a textually unattested maslaha, the maslaha mursala, serves as a rationale or a ratio legis, an illa, in order to determine a new ruling. Yet Al-Ghazali limited the use of such unattested maslahas, saying that only a maslaha that applies universally to all Muslims, that is necessary and that is known with certainty, is valid. For example, he argued that in case an infidel enemy army shields itself with Muslim prisoners of war, it was legally permissible to violate the Quranic prohibition of killing fellow Muslims and shoot at the Muslim human shield when it was certain that thereby the lives of all Muslims were saved from perdition. In contrast, Al-Ghazali argued a battle over one of the many fortresses along the borders of Muslim territories would not qualify to permit shooting at a Muslim human shield. Once Al-Ghazali introduced maslaha as a valid method to determine rulings for cases that lack direct textual evidence, it soon became entrenched in discussions of usul al-fiqh. We have to give credit to Fakhruddin Razi, who died in 1210, as the one who paved the way for firmly anchoring maslaha, and in particular the maslaha mursala, into the textual sources of Quran and Hadith, by arguing that all instances of maslaha are found in the revealed law either specifically or in their general meaning. In short, any ruling that establishes maslaha is in harmony with the divine law unless the law specifically invalidates it. While Ar-Razi envisioned to employ notions of maslaha only within the procedure of legal analogy, later jurists enlarged its scope of application. Significant was that maslaha, as the purpose or objective of the law, came to be employed in the area of qawa'id, that's legal precepts. Legal precepts are short statements that are abstracted from the corpus of legal rulings, summarizing the principles that guide the decision-making process. The inductive reasoning process involved in formulating precepts also prompted scholars to search for the most important maxims in law finding and thereby for the purposes of the law. Hence, definitions of precepts frequently reflect the intentions of the lawgiver to avert hardship, mashaqqa, and harm, darar, and to promote benefit, nafa. We find the 13th century Maliki jurist Al-Qarafi draw upon the precept to attain maslaha and avert mafsada as an arbiter in case of conflicting legal indicants that were all legitimate but contradictory. That is, he used it as a criterion to exercise tarjih. Moreover, he interpreted concepts like granting license, rukhsa, and blocking means to illegal ends, sada dharaya, in light of the purpose of the law. Hence, license to transgress a divine ruling, according to Al-Qarafi, is granted when following it would lead to more harm than maslaha. For example, should a person be faced with death or uttering words of unbelief, the maslaha of saving one's life weighs greater than the prohibition of apostasy. Al-Qarafi also employed the purposes of the law to expand the concept of blocking the means. He applied it not only to prevent misuse of legal means to illegal ends, but also to permit illegal means that result in greater maslaha. For instance, he approved of paying ransom for Muslim prisoners of war, even though benefiting the enemy is prohibited, arguing that freeing the prisoners is of greater maslaha. These two approaches of using maslaha in analogy and in legal precepts were in the pre-modern period the dominant ways of integrating the maqasid al-sharia into actual law finding. Both approaches have several features in common. First, maslaha and the maqasid al-sharia were not seen as an independent source of law. There are, to the best of my knowledge, no convincing calls of adding maslaha to the traditionally accepted four sources of law. Second, maslaha and the purposes of the law were discussed primarily within the divisions and the categories that Al-Ghazali articulated, though with amendments and refinements. Generally accepted were the division into necessities, darurat, needs, hajat, and matters of improvement, tahsinat, and that the number of necessities was limited to those 5 listed by Al-Ghazali, even if there was no agreement on their hierarchy, and some jurists substituted offspring with honor, with ird. Another feature of pre-modern interpretations is a focus on individual legal cases. Jurists primarily referenced maslaha and the maqasid al-sharia when arguing for the validity of particular laws that were not directly found in the scriptural sources. One may say that in the pre-modern period, most jurists focused on maslaha as a tool to derive a particular legal ruling and as a criterion by which to judge the correctness of a ruling, thereby often limiting the application of the existing law or integrating new rulings into the framework of the Sharia. The larger framework of the purposes of the law was discussed mainly in order to justify employing maslaha in law-finding procedures. When we look at the contemporary period, in particular, and legal works written since about the middle of the 20th century, the parameters of the debate change. The most important shifts are a focus on the maqasid al-sharia instead of maslaha. Scholars of the 20th and 21st centuries often focus on the intentions of the divine law and then discuss how to achieve these objectives by attaining maslaha and averting mafsada. Furthermore, contemporary scholars consider that the maqasid al-sharia are known with certainty, qat'. That means that they are, from a legal perspective, not just valid, but binding on the believer. In focusing on the maqasid al-sharia, many contemporary scholars also reference the 14th century scholars Ash-Shatibi as well as At-Tufi, who had more comprehensive theories of integrating the maqasid al-sharia into law finding. But it has to be mentioned that neither of these scholars was influential prior to the modern period. Another shift is noticeable in the way contemporary scholars think about maslaha, namely that they criticize the way Al-Ghazali defined the maqasid al-sharia and that they broaden the definition of what constitutes maslaha beyond Al-Ghazali's 5 necessities. Another shift also is that scholars tend to consider maslaha from a societal perspective rather than understanding it primarily at the level of the individual. Let me give you some examples of how these shifts in the discourse on maslaha and the maqasid al-sharia are articulated. For example, the Moroccan scholar Ahmad al-Khamlishi states that, quote, "It is insufficient today to confine oneself and take as a reference point for ordering society and relations among individuals the maqasid, or 5 higher maslahas that Al-Ghazali set forth," end of quote. Scholars such as the Tunisian Ibn Ashur, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, or Gamal ad-Din Atiyah argue that paying attention to the maslahas of the individual and defining them in terms of protecting the 5 necessities is limiting Muslims' understanding of the purposes of the law. They criticize that the focus on the individual prevented from looking at society, at the ummah, the state, and human relations more broadly. Also, we see that scholars today reject the way Al-Ghazali justified the 5 necessary elements, namely on account of the prohibitions and punishments expressed in the texts about apostasy, murder, drinking wine, fornication, and theft. Hence, Al-Qaradawi, for example, states that the textual sources provide many more positive instances that encourage the protection of the intellect than only the negative prohibition against drinking wine. As evidence, he refers to the frequent encouragement in Quran and Hadith to seek knowledge, talab al-ilm. Similarly, Al-Khamlishi rejects to count the protection of property, mal, among the purposes of the law, arguing instead that the Quranic verses that deal with property nowhere command its preservation. How can it be correct, he asks, that safeguarding property is a purpose of Islam when people's desire to amass and preserve property is ruining today's society and deprives it of the value of moderation, qina'a, solidarity, takaful, and compassion, rahmah. Similarly, Ibn Ashur also interprets the application of the 5 necessities in broad societal terms. For instance, he says that the preservation of life, nafs, means to protect lives from destruction on the level of the individual and society, which includes, for example, preventing the outbreak of contagious diseases. Understanding the protection of life only in terms of retaliation, qisas, is, according to him, the weakest form because it takes effect after a life is lost. The sentiment that the definition of the maqasid needs to be expanded is echoed by Al-Qaradawi. He argues that even more relevant than the 5 necessities among the purposes of the divine law are the preservation of values like freedom, hurriya, equality, musawa, fraternity, ikha, solidarity, takaful, and human rights, huquq al-insan. Some scholars understand these necessities in terms of rights and entitlements. For instance, Ismail al-Hassani argues that among the necessities, one also needs to count the right to freedom of expression, to political association, to elect and remove rulers, as well as the right to employment, food, housing, clothing, and medical treatment. Among more recent publications on Maslaha and the purposes of the law, one finds works that may be called system approach. Their authors try to provide a holistic approach to ordering human life on the basis of Maslaha and the Maqasid al-Sharia. The work of Gamal ad-Din Atiyah, for example, falls into that category. Atiyah, in his book Towards Realization of the Higher Intents of Islamic Law, enumerates 24 essential purposes of the law, which he then classifies into 4 interrelated realms, that of the individual, the family, the ummah, and wider humanity. For each intention, he provides a definition, how it can be achieved, and what is connected to it. For example, Atiyah lists as the first purpose of the divine law for the individual the preservation of human life, which means to protect life from harm, damage to the body, and death. This purpose is achieved by providing security in form of prohibitions of murder, assault, and suicide, as well as enforcing the laws of retaliation. In addition, Atiyah includes in this category also the basic human needs of food, clothing, and shelter, as well as protection against mortal dangers such as fire, drowning, car accidents, and radiation. Beyond preserving the physical well-being of the body, the preservation of life also means for Atiyah to attend to psychological and spiritual needs. He points out that protecting personal freedom and dignity is an objective of the law because without them, life could not be preserved. As these examples show, contemporary scholars have a much broader interpretation of the purposes of the law than their counterparts of previous centuries. They turn away from focusing on maslaha as a procedural tool for resolving cases They expand its scope by looking at maslahas that affect society at large, and they interpret the essential necessities in light of today's relationships between the individual, society, and the state. Hence, they include collective values such as justice, equality, freedom, human rights, political participation, and equal opportunities. These universal objectives are not based on individual statements in the sacred texts, but derived inductively from the texts. So what do these shifts in understanding Maslaha and the Maqasid al-Sharia mean for Islamic law? They open up possibilities, but they also pose challenges. Focusing on the more abstract and collective application of Maslaha and the Maqasid al-Sharia facilitates a legal system that is adaptable according to place and time. Universal values, such as preserving life, can be realized according to context and hence permit a variety of particular rulings and policies. It allows Islamic law to be applicable to different environments and legal change to be an integral part of the legal system. The move toward more abstract communal purposes, however, makes it all the more difficult to define them precisely. The lack of agreement on how to define what constitutes maslaha in concrete terms and its relationship to the textually explicit rulings of Quran and Sunnah leaves it open to much controversy. Unresolved in contemporary discussions of the Maqasid al-Sharia is the tension between universalism and subjective interpretation of what these universals mean. Hence, we find very different results when comparing different scholars' interpretation of the Maqasid. For example, the Bosnian scholar Adis Dudaria and the Egyptian Gamal ad-Din Atiyah both identify as divine objectives for the family values such as affection, mawadda, compassion, rahma, and repose, sakina. Yet Dudaria interprets these purposes as evidence for a gender egalitarian Islamic family law, whereas Atiyah employs them to assert traditional gender hierarchies. Such differences in interpretation can allow for innovative application of Islamic law or can lead to authoritarian abuse in the name of God's intentions by state institutions or vigilante. Another observation about the intense focus on the purposes of the law is that it approaches an ideology. The maqasid are no longer debated in connection with methods of law finding, but are used as an ideology for policy and action. The onus to put the maqasid al-Sharia into practice is put on the state by establishing policies, laws, and institutions that protect the necessities and realize God's objectives for humankind. This constitutes a profound shift which reflects the role of law in the modern nation state and the state's exclusive claim on the sphere of law. It is no longer the individual jurist who has to decide whether a particular ruling or a course of action agrees with the purposes of the lawgiver, but it is the state and its functionaries, including legislative bodies, that is responsible for articulating and realizing them, whether it is policies to prevent the outbreak of epidemics or providing education for all. In this respect, the maqasid al-Sharia are akin to what Ibn Taymiyyah called siyasa shar'iyya, governance in accordance with the divine law. Yet implementing the maqasid al-Sharia in the nation-state system remains at present rather vague. Hardly ever addressed are questions as to who exactly in a state legal system has the right or is capable of determining the purposes of the Sharia. Is it trained ulama or state legislators? Difficult questions, such as citizens with diverse religious affiliations, have rarely been addressed satisfactorily without creating an unequal dhimmi status for non-Muslims and crying apostasy at Muslims who exercise religious freedom. Likewise, how to implement the particulars of the Quranic text in those cases where Muslims' attitudes are changing, such as toward executing the hudud punishments or the role of women in society, still has to be resolved. And importantly, the limits of the reach of the nation state and its legal institutions into the behavior of its citizens, from legislation to enforcement, that is the line between legal and moral, or between a criminal offense and a moral infraction, has rarely been explored in any serious matter. Is it a religious offense when I do not use my seatbelt in a car, or is it just a traffic violation? Nevertheless, the attention that scholars devote to the objectives of Islamic law and the innovative interpretations they articulate have the potential to open up new avenues of accomplishing legal change and giving Sharia a role and place in the global world. Thank you.
In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, all prayers are due to our Prophet Mohammed, his household, and his companions. I hope I'll be brief in my remarks. I would like to answer 4 questions. The first question, what is Maslaha? Or perhaps 3 questions. What is Maslaha? And how do we appreciate it? And how do we know that it is a Maslaha? But before that, I would like to give you a prelude or introduction to explain the developments that led to my concept of Maslaha, and I'll go back to the history of the matter. The question of Maslaha is complicated, and it is current for a number of considerations, because we do have a multiple use of Maslaha, and the indications of the Maslaha is ambiguous as well, because it is an interdisciplinary kind of domain that we use the Maslaha in. And if we look at the tyranny across this region and the authoritarianism, then we need to understand who pulls the string of this matter. Are we talking about the authority, the individual, the jurist? Who defines the maslaha? Indeed, the usage of the maslaha, as Professor Opwis said, the history shows that that this issue was contentious when it comes to the source of legislation. But then maslaha became a source of legislation or a source of the law. It has become the source of the law on the part of the Malikis and the Hanbalis school of thoughts. But the other school of thoughts agreed that it is a part and parcel of the analogy, the qiyas, that relates to the ratio legis itself on the part of the Shafi'is and the Hanbalis. So here we do have a concept or an impression of the maslaha as a tool and as a source on the part of the Malikis and the Hanafis. This took place at the time of the classical era. However, in our era, we had witnessed a number of developments. The reformers, I mean Muhammad Abdu and his ilks, resorted to the idea of the higher objectives and the maslaha to underpin the following idea: to cite the Western ideas, and also to put into place institutions, to establish institutions, and to make use of the public space. That means the maslaha was utilized at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, within the religious reform, and in part it was done so in line with modernity. And later on, the revival movement, and Hassan al-Banna was at the helm of such movement, and the maslaha was looked at as a part and parcel of the holistic Islamic system. in contrast to the communist or the capitalist systems. When it comes to the modern discourse, since the 60s, here I'm talking about the Arab discourse, Maslaha was used to build the idea of the independent diligence of humans away from religion. So indeed, or away from the script rather, in order to have the term of reference, i.e. the reason, the intellect, because we have witnessed a rational kind of wave at that time, and a number of scholars turned rational at that time, and they didn't depend on the text. Lately, the Maslaha was embedded in politics, whether by leftists or they on the right or in the middle, the revolutionaries and otherwise, everybody used the Maslaha to their kind of favor, especially during the Arab revolution. So the idea of the Maslaha refers us, in my opinion, to the problem of revelation and the rationality. And here we are talking about the embellishment or the good and the bad. Here we can cite the ruling. Does it depend on the text or does it depend on the rationale or the reason? And here we can differentiate between three points or three elements. The first is that the Maslaha might become the objective of the legislator, i.e. Allah, and secondly, as benefit for humans and his or her selections or choices, and the third, the Maslaha as a ratio legacy to the fiqh ruling itself. So here, the Maslaha pushes us towards rationality, and it expands and shrinks in accordance with the affiliations and in accordance with the individual's propensities. However, after this kind of prelude and the paths of the Maslaha and its manifestations, we'd like to define the Maslaha itself. In the Western philosophy, there is something that we call pragmatism. Thus, talking about pragmatism relates to the benefit of the community and the benefit of the individual. However, when it comes to the Islamic fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, the definitions of the Maslaha, one that was alluded by Professor Opwis, Al-Ghazali alluded to the fact that the Maslaha is to do with religion, life, intellect, offspring, and property. The five necessities or the five higher goals, and they do align to the Maslaha, and they are the same. However, Al-Izz ibn Abd salam in the 7th century as well said that Maslaha is pleasures, and a pleasure and its causes, joy and its causes. As a matter of fact, joy and pleasure are Quranic terms, and these kind of two terms have been used in the Quran, pleasure and joy. And Ash-Shatibi, the third character here, before I delve into the meaning, Imam Ash-Shatibi defined the Maslaha as being the thing that provides welfare and prosperity to human beings in an absolute manner in order for him or her to live as such. So this has been derived from a certain context, because some of the contemporary scholars quoted this quotation, but he didn't quote it properly, but I'll explain the reasons later. So these kind of three definitions, Al-Ghazali's definition, the Al-Izz definitions, and Ash-Shatibi's definition, might allude to the fact that interest or maslaha is to do with lust, desires, and pleasures. However, we need to reach a common ground here, whereby every scholar agreed upon. There is no difference between what I have quoted and the others. There is no difference that this is not the objective, i.e., talking about the psychological desires is one thing and maslaha is another. Al-Izz ibn Abd salam, for example, and Ash-Shatibi and others talked about the absolutism of the masalih or the interest. There is a difference between the Sharia-related maslaha and the absolute maslaha. Al-Izz ibn Abd salam and Ash-Shatibi talked about this absolute angle. However, Al-Ghazali talked about the Sharia-related maslaha. The other issue is that Al-Izz ibn Abd salam and Ash-Shatibi talked about this life's maslaha and the hereafter's maslaha, and thus Ash-Shatibi defined the dunya maslaha as I said just a minute ago. And consequently, the Shatibi talked about two levels or two layers of the maslaha. The maslaha in existence and the maslaha whereby it aligns itself to the discourse of the Sharia itself. So there is a maslaha in the reality and there is a religious discourse that relates to it. So he abolishes one and shed light on the other. And indeed, those who didn't deal with the matter accurately, who didn't differentiate between the absolute part and the narrow part, were ensnared in a certain ambush. And thus, the maslaha is divided into three: the Sharia related, and the other one that is abolished, whereby the text said that it might be a maslaha, however, it's not considered as a maslaha, like adultery. Even if it was consensual between the two parties, this is superficially a maslaha, but the legislator said it is an inconsidered kind of maslaha, then it was abolished and it was banned. And some maslaha the legislator didn't comment on, and indeed here we're talking about the unattested maslaha. There is a difference between the scholars in dealing with the unattested maslaha. Some of the scholars lean right and some of them lean left in accordance with the interpretation, in accordance with the standards of the school of thought of such scholars. So this discussion is based on a holistic vision that we need to understand, and it is a must, it is guaranteed by all these scholars, i.e. the dunya leads to the hereafter, and thus Al-Ghazali, Al-Izz ibn Abd salam, Al-Shatibi were occupied with aggrandizing the goods and making the goods at the epicenter of their work. So Al-Izz ibn Abd salam was always focusing on this meaning, Al-Shatibi as well. Al-Muwafaqat actually delved into the way of goodness in order to compound the reward. Dunya and deen, religion and life are intertwining in their eyes. Al-Mawardi talked about this matter. He has a book called Adab al-Dunya wa Deen, the ethics of the current life and the ethics of the hereafter. Imam Al-Izz ibn Abd salam was frank when he said that the preservation of the body is to do with worshipping. We don't preserve our body per se, we preserve the body because we can't have a diseased kind of body and worship God in the way that he wanted us to do so. And thus here I'm talking about the overlap and the intertwining element. The third issue is that fiqh is based on attaching a Sharia ruling to every single conduct of human beings. So we need to understand this in accordance with such contentious issues. The central plank here is that the higher objective of Sharia is for dispensing with the whims of the humans so that they would become slaves to God. And indeed, humans usually descend to obscenity and lechery and lust. However, God advised us to do the total opposite. And this is the function of religion, the ethical function of religion. And indeed, here we talk about rectitude, and we talk about interest, we talk about maslaha. When we go back to the 19th century and the 20th century, the efforts were to do with conforming the reform with the West. However, when we go back to the classical era, things were different. In contrast, when we look at Plato, his aphorism is to do with the three parts of the nafs, three parts of the self. The lust-related self, the anger-related self, and the rational related or the reason-related self. And these three selves, if I might say, lead to three virtues. The lust would lead to the virtue, and the anger would lead to bravery, and then the reason would lead to wisdom, and as a matter of fact, chastity and the other two would lead to justice. So Plato said that virtues are four in total. However, who can define such virtues? As a matter of fact, reason has the upper hand when it comes to the anger and the lust. So the reason will have the upper hand, the reason will pull the strings, and thus the reason will tame the angry self and the lust-related self, and thus virtue will surface, or chastity will surface. So Plato talked about reason extensively and said it is the optimum virtue. And when it comes to the jurists, the Islamic jurists, they said that as long as we understand the source of humans, the origin of humans, or rather the propensity of humans to lust, but this refinement and the compliance would become effective if we follow the commands of God. So we have delved into analyzing these commands. However, the Sufis, Al-Shatibi, Al-Azim Abd Salam, and Al-Ghazali, they are both jurists and Sufis. They wanted to provide another implicit link in accordance with these selves, and thus we understood that there is a mix between the two in their writings. When it comes to European modernity, in contrast, modernity in Europe bridged the gap between the implicit and explicit. They both are the same, in accordance with the rationale, the independence of the individual, and the freedom to meet the desires within the law. That is consensual by everyone. However, the variable was to do with the emergence of the state. And this modern nation state, we're talking about modern nation states, not only one state. So this was the variable, and the modern nation Western state has become, or has dealt with liberalism and democracy. The liberalism will protect the rights of individuals on one hand, and democracy will protect the rights of the majority. So this twining between the individual's right and the community rights were achieved by democracy and liberalism. However, in our Arab world, we have witnessed despotism, and the implicit as well as the explicit, the gap between them was deepened, and thus this dichotomy was deepened. Our contemporary jurists wanted to bridge this gap under the pressure of modernity and its achievements and the authoritarian regimes. Now, who could appreciate or perhaps weigh the maslaha in accordance with such variables? We need to understand that the Islamic thought was and still based on three elements: the right of God, the right of slaves, and the mutual rights between the two. This is the triangle that we depend on: what is right for God, what is right for humans or creatures, and what is right mutually between God and humans. And God says, I have created jinn and humans for them to worship. And then we can differentiate between two parts here, the ritual kind of part and the customs elements. When we talk about rituals, these kind of rituals are outside the realm of individual interest or the narrow kind of meaning. However, if we look at Al-Izm, Al-Salam and Al-Shatibi, then they are embedded. Even the rituals or the worships are embedded because they dealt with the dunya, with this life and hereafter in their definition. And thus, this is the first, the ritual. When it comes to the custom related, it relates to the rights of humans, and this custom related might be individual and might be communal, societal or subjective. But now, in accordance with such categorizations, who will understand such maslaha, and who will emphasize the maslaha from which angle? In accordance with the jurist, the right of God has a supreme kind of a priority. And I won't delve deep into this matter, but in brief, I think that the estimation or the measurement of the maslaha relates to the individual's rights themselves, or perhaps those dependents or parents if they are minors. The role of the fiqh comes along when it comes to fatwa, whereby there are some issues that are ambiguous, and thus the mufti or the grand mufti would provide certain advice, and the fatwa is not an obligation. And thus, Ash-Shatibi, in 4 different positions, he would say that every person is a jurist on himself or herself. Every person understands what he or she does. This relates to meeting the objectives. Every single person would worship God and would understand what he would feel. No any other person would understand that. The idea here is that there is a room to maneuver. We said that there are abolished maslahas and there are other maslahas that are unstated, and these unattested maslahas were loose, and the scholars tapped into it from different angles, and thus it was, as I said, loose. And we need to resort to the intellectual reasoning that is individual when it comes to the considered, inconsidered, and unattested maslahas, because there are limits, the minimum and the maximum, and the maximum is the hope and the minimum is fear. So humans usually, when they move, when they live between the two extremes, fear on one hand and hope from the other hand. So hope inches closer to the maximum of such maslaha, and the minimum is to do with fear. Perhaps I'll conclude with the following and we can answer questions later, but I would like to say that the frame that governs the estimation of the individuals when it comes to maslaha, I think from one perspective we can talk about two kind of estimations, or two kind of issues. The issue whereby interest is intrinsic to individuals, and the other part that is intrinsic to others. When it comes to this maslaha, whereby there are desires that are individual, Ash-Shatibi talked about this matter, and here our desires ought to conform with the objectives of the legislator, i.e. God, and thus cannot deal with thus pleasures or lust and so on and so forth only in accordance with what the legislator said. I'll stop here and might answer later any questions that relate to Maslaha. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the 3 speakers. I will not give my own explanations, footnotes and margins for what you have listened so far, also because of the limited time we have maybe less than half an hour for the discussion. So I will move directly to the questions. We will take a couple of questions together and then I give the speakers the chance to respond. So please. Can you give the mic? And because of the limited time also, I would really, really like that you limit yourself and get to the point directly about your question. Thank you very much for collaboration. Yes, please.
I have a question. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very valuable. The question is, if maslaha or public benefit allowed in the past for a dictator's, a ruler's wish or command to override what is, from a fiqh point of view, accepted as what is right and wrong. For example, if a ruler came by force, then al-khuruj al-hakim, to go against that was regarded as wrong, because the mafsada, is greater, the public mafsada is greater than the, the benefit of having order in society. Why is it then that nowadays people from an Islamic perspective oppose democracy, absolute democracy, using the argument that some of the rules that will result from democratic legislation may contradict some of the fiqh? If they use the same argument of saying, okay, because there is maslaha in this context.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Another question? Yes, please.
When it comes to maslaha within Muslim majority countries, what is the applied framework between states and intellectuals or theologians who should take the ownership of moving forward and implementing on maslaha? And in the same manner, when it comes to Muslim minority countries, including West, how Muslims can contribute through their theological understanding of maslaha to the common good? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you. Sorry. The reason actually why I came to this conference, I'll just speak about my personal experience because I'm not theologian, just practitioner, is basically to try to replace the concept of interest. And so I've gone through a lot of readings for that, and then I found this concept of maslaha versus mafsada. Is it correct to basically replace interest, which is basically really at the center of all interactions of modern societies, from financial interactions to human interactions, by the concept of maslaha versus mafsada? Thank you.
You understand the question? Would you please reformulate your question? You mean interest in the bank sector?
Yeah.
Or what's interest? What do you financial interest? You mean?
Yeah, actually, in legal frameworks, you always find interest to be really the central concept, and you find that indeed in financial transactions, and you also find that in actually when we negotiate, whether for commercial transactions or human interactions as well.
You mean like people's best interests?
For example.
Protecting?
Yeah.
Okay. You got that. Okay. Other question, yes, please.
I am Dr. Afzal. I've got a simple, small question. Do we need a religion, not specifically Islam, to decide about public interest or maslaha? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you for your presentations. I have a question. If we just, I think that the Maqasid framework is, the necessities are common for everybody and everybody agrees on them except for religion. I think And she said, the doctor said that for protecting dignity or I think if you want to protect that is not related to fornication, it's related to protecting women from like abuse or something else. And I think this framework will help in just giving a framework that everybody agrees on it. If we let it open, then the conflict will start.
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Yes, please, at the back side.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أول شيء أشكركم.
First of all, I would like to thank you for this presentation. I would like to particularly thank Dr. Mu'taz. He was very brief and to the point. My question.
Practicing ethics and morals and stop being virtual or doing virtue. Can we call them Muslims or Christian or Jewish? So if they stop doing the moral things and ethics and the ethical values, can we still calling them Muslims, Christian and Jewish? Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions?
Assalamu alaikum. I wanted to ask a question about minority groups, like Muslim minorities in the West, for instance, and they have a interest in working with certain organizations or institutions, and those same institutions might harm Muslims in another country. So how would that work, where they might benefit in their context, but that same institution harms other Muslims in another place?
Thank you. Other questions? Okay. I didn't miss anybody. Okay. Who wants to start? We have 7 questions. Would you like to start?
I can start with some of them.
Yes, please.
I can start with some of them. And for example, what I gave, I mean, the question you raised about zina being a protection of offspring as opposed to protection of women. What I completely agree with you, but these are different. What I was doing is showing how scholars in the past defined these terms. And as you were mentioning, and you are certainly not the only one, contemporary scholars see the prohibition of zina not necessarily only in terms of family and lineage, but seeing it as a protection of women, of society, and morals more generally. Again, this is part of the trend to understand the maqasid as well as the darurat more on a societal basis as opposed to limited to individuals. And maybe I think I can also answer, or at least try to answer, the question about minorities in the West, if they work in institutions that, or organizations that harm Muslims elsewhere. I mean, these are very deep moral questions. Should you then stop working for them? Should you oppose them? And what's in your best interest? And here again, I think this goes back to what Dr. Koons is saying also, that there is a question between the personal interest and a communal interest. And I think it will vary depending on time and circumstances what prevails for the individual. If that person has the choice to say, I leave that job and work elsewhere in a different organization that does not harm Muslims elsewhere, then I think this is, again, the conscience that speaks. But there is no clear-cut guidelines on how to deal with such situations, and certainly not from a purely legal point. This is where the morality point comes into play. And one of the questions was also that who should take ownership of Maslaha? Is it the jurists? Is it the intellectuals? Is it the state? And I think this really depends on the purpose of what one sees is the Maqasid al-Sharia. Should the Maqasid al-Sharia be a guideline and for state legislation? And then especially today when we think about everybody has the access to the texts, as this one questioner was commenting. Should there be this democratization of access to knowledge as well as in the participatory process? And my personal opinion is yes, it should be. But I think sometimes we also agree that we, while we all have a certain amount of knowledge about health and illness, we still go to a physician to have us checked out. And so maybe experts, and that can be legal scholars, the ulama, as well as scholars working in bioethics or other fields, will probably have to also shape the discussion, because the modern world is to a certain extent way too complex for one person to understand it all. And in the same way as in the pre-modern period, a mufti also would go to an expert and ask for advice, be that a physician, be that a carpenter, or be that about a housemaking and things like that. So in this regard, I don't think it is only the exclusive sphere of the ulama to determine what is a maslaha, what is especially if one understands maslaha and the maqasid al-sharia as a public good, in the same way that Dr. Koons was addressing at the beginning, then public means that the public also has to determine and decide it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, Koons, would you like to comment?
Sure. I can address maybe a couple of the questions. You know, I think the question of who gets to decide public benefit is, well, I mean, it's a very important question when you're dealing with, particularly in questions of development, because you oftentimes, for example, an aid organization or the United Nations wants some concrete measure of some developmental indices, and they have to have some measure that they can apply across different cultures, and it's not tied to a particular religious tradition. So, for example, I know particularly influential in development circles has been the capabilities approach that's been developed by the Indian Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, the American philosopher. And this is the idea that you measure people's well-being in terms of essential human capabilities like education and life and play and the ability to practice religion. And you know, to hear them talk about it, you know, they've developed this list. In a way, it's an intuitive list, but in a way, it's also a list that they've developed through years of cross-cultural consultation, talking to people in different countries from different religions, and you know, it's a way of, you know, it's what someone like John Rawls would call, you know, non-overlapping consensus. People coming from different positions, whether they're Muslim or Christian or atheist or whatever, nevertheless, even though their values have a different source, they still value the same things, and you can still come up with a common conception that overlaps in a lot of places as to what constitutes the good. And we can all agree that, you know, well, not all of us, but most of us can agree that, you know, autonomy is a good, that life is a good, that the ability to control your reproductive life is a good, that the ability to engage in activities for their own sake, like play is a good, knowledge is a good, education is a good. I mean, these are not controversial things, and you can measure development by the degree to which people have access to these things. And if people don't have access to these things, then there's a development opportunity and maybe a development failure, right? So, I think that measuring public benefit or indices of public benefit is not the prerogative of just one group. It's something that there can be broad agreement on. There was another question about, I actually only caught the tail end of it because I didn't take my headphones off at the right time, about if someone quits practicing virtue, can you call them still call them a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew? Did I miss the?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a famous old joke about a bunch of Scotsmen sitting in a bar, and they see a report on the TV of a murder, and they say, well, obviously that wasn't a Scotsman. No true Scotsman would have done that. And the next day they're in the bar, and the news report says, Sam McInerney of Inverness is arrested for the murder. And they say, well, no true Scotsman would have done this murder, right? And this is the no true Scotsman fallacy. I think we're very quick to say when we see someone of our faith doing something terrible, they're not really whatever I am, a Christian or a Muslim or whatever. They are. They're just a bad one, right? I think is the right thing to say. I'm an American, and I see Christians doing bad things all the time. And I'm not personally Christian, but I think you have to take ownership of the fact that a lot of people do, with real sincerity and real belief that they're acting piously, do things for religious reasons. And you can't just say, well, they're not, or just out of, maybe not out of piety, maybe just out of weakness and vice and virtue. I believe it was Augustine's famous prayer, Lord, make me virtuous, but not yet, right? He was a real Christian, just a bad one to start out with. So, I think there's a lot of room to say that someone really is a Muslim, really is a Jew, really is a Christian. They're just a bad one. Either a bad one because of misplaced piety or because of just weakness and badness. That would be my view. I think we should really be careful of this no true Scotsman fallacy and try to fight shy of that.
Thank you very much. I think that I'll start with a quotation vis-a-vis David from Rachel. They wrote a book after the 9th of the September the 11th, and David was an advisor to George W. Bush, and they agree that killing the innocent is wrong. However, who is the innocent? That's the point. We disagree on the innocence. When it comes to the political landscape, I think the issue is to do with the concepts. We do all agree that killing innocent is an immoral act. However, how could we define the innocence? Dr. Koons has gave us an example about autonomy. How could we define the autonomy itself? Autonomy is good, but how could we define it? There are different contours and different autonomies, and can we have autonomy in countries that are despotic? And how could we limit the autonomy itself when it comes to power? Because power might lead to certain propaganda and might brainwash certain people through the media and so on and so forth. So the values are there, but in light of the state and modernity, I think that the concepts are convoluted and we cannot pinpoint them at all times. We need to differentiate between two issues here. Okay, he's talking about the ruler and how it is possible to rebel against rulers. Scholars do say that it is permissible. Some of them say that it is forbidden. It depends on the politics of the state itself. And democratic institutions that might have rules in place that overcome the Sharia-related rulings is not acceptable. What kind of scholars? I haven't seen any one scholar who said that democracy, the absolute democracy that might provide us with legislations on a consensual base and contradicts with the rules of Sharia are acceptable. I didn't hear any of them say that. They say that democracy within the frame of Sharia. So they abolished kind of democracy in the first place. Our neighbor, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, talked about freedom before Sharia. This is an example. Rashid al-Ghannouchi. Do we think that al-Qaradawi agreed to having laws contradicting the Sharia itself? No, your hypothesis is wrong. The issue is to do with the consensus of the majority. Al-Qaradawi said freedom comes before Sharia. And he said that years ago, and yes, I heard about freedom, but still, yes, he said that in 2007. And Rashid al-Ghannouchi wrote a book about this issue. I think the contentious issue is to do with some of the muftis who work within the framework of the state and the regime. Since the 80s, no one except the jihadi Salafist, no one said that I do oppose democracy. No. Perhaps I misunderstood them and I lived with them. They say that Sharia, that democracy needs to be entrenched when it does not contradict Sharia. As far as regardless of such contradiction, when it comes to obedience, there are issues that are contentious as well. During the last 5-6 years, one party talked about this issue. Ali Jum'a, Al-Bouti, Ahmed Tayyib, Ahmed Hassoun talked about not rebelling, or they banned rebelling against the ruler because they were officials, they were working for the state. However, other muftis said no, you can rebel against the ruler for the sake of freedom. So there is a ruling and there is a utilization of the ruling itself. If you go back to history, up until the 3rd Hijri century, people used to rebel. Yes, there were jurists who said no, you can't rebel, but this was a contentious issue as well. Abu Hanifa supported rebelling against the ruler, and he used to finance secretly one jurist to kind of participate in a coup d'etat against the Abbasids. Al-Hassan al-Basri as well. A number of jurists up until the 3rd century, they were supporting rebellion. And even this debate was ethical. It was to do with the battlefields and the bloodshed. Even in the Medina, Al-Hajjaj came to Mecca as well and wreaked havoc in Mecca. So because of such tribulations, they had a pretext, and they said if we strike a balance between changing the ruler, the maslaha of changing the ruler and the maslaha of not shedding blood, in accordance with their discretion, they ended up having certain fatwas. But today, some of the scholars think that this ruling is absolute. No, it is not absolute. It depends on the balance of probabilities. Ibn Hajar and Nawawi are exclusions, and they said that it is an absolute ruling. However, a lot of scholars said no. The fatwa ought to be justified. If the despot can be chained without bloodshed, then so be it. It is a must.
we need the religion to own the maslaha. I said that there are maslahas that relate to this dunya and others that relate to the hereafter. And Al-Aziz ibn Abdul Salam talked about the rationale, the reason, to follow the reason in order to understand the maslaha. He talked about these sources whereby we could understand the dunya-related maslaha. That means the maslaha in this life relates to reason, not to the sharia. However, the hereafter maslaha relates to the sharia because we need to understand it through the text, through the scripture. I said if we talk about the maslaha and the link thereby with the hereafter, then the legislator, God, has the upper hand. But when it comes to subjectivity, then you need also to follow the commands of God. If you are a virtuous human being, you ought to resort to the mufti. However, you cannot follow the mufti as if you are a remote control in his hand. No, you have a reason and you need to tap into your reason and you need to differentiate between the two. I think this would suffice.
Then we come to conclude this evening. I hereby thank the speakers and I thank you very much for your interventions and your contributions and your questions. And we meet inshallah in the future on another occasion and another evening. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you.